Hey everyone, Card Cafe here, back with some more deck profiles now that we finally have set 5, the long-awaited set that has brought me my personal favorite grade 3 in a long time, the deck I have been waiting for for months now. Liael Odium, Dark Leal, Edgy Leal, the better half, whatever you want to call her. The goddess herself is here, and I'm very excited to talk about this card. It's a really cool deck with probably one of, if not the strongest divine skill in the game. I sadly did not pull the secret rare, the most expensive card in the set, out of our case. I did get this nice SR, which is a good consolation prize. No secret. I did get a secret rare from our case for a different card that I won't spoil here. You have to wait for the next video to see what secret we got. But for now, we're here to talk about Liael Odium. So let's get into it. Let's start off with this ride line here. So it's a pretty unique one because of what Liael Odium does specifically. So obviously the grade 0 is the same as always. When rode upon going second, draw a card. Great, we love it. The grade 1, though, is where things start getting interesting. So he says, when he's placed from riding on a grade 0, you reveal a copy of Liael specifically from your ride deck, and you get to take a Destined timepiece, this card right here, that wasn't obvious, and put it in your order zone. Now, what is a Destined timepiece? So the Destined timepiece is kind of like Impaldio's little like orb it puts in its order zone. Kind of like a set order, not really. It's a little bit of a separate, unique skill, which this one says, if this is in your order zone, you have to only ride cards with Leal in their name. And you can have Regulus gauge pieces. Now that's a fancy term that just is a gimmick that is cards in your bind zone turning on your effects is really what it boils down to. Is just a fancy name to give cards in your bind zone that activate your effects depending on how many are in there. But cool little mechanic. So you get that as soon as you ride this, so long as you reveal Leal. And then the grade 2 says, when he rides on top of the grade 1 specifically, you put a card from your hand into your gauge as a Regulus gauge, and you get to draw 2 cards. So really good early game skill of just being able to essentially lose a card to draw 2. And you're not even really losing the card because it's going to your gauge and fueling your gauge number. Plus you have cards that interact by going into the gauge zone or coming out of it. So depending on what's in your hand, this can just be a really good setup to be able to do that. So really good. We love drawing 2 cards on turn 2. But now Leal herself. So let's talk about her in all of her glory. So her first effect, which is that during your turn, a continuous, all of your from her rear guards get power plus 5k for each of your Disordered Bane Regulus gauges. So essentially for every copy of this Distorted Bane card that we'll talk about in a little bit, that you have is your gauge, it gets 5k, and that does stack. So if you have 4 copies of Distorted Bane, your front row rear guards are getting 20,000 power. So that's a very significant bump in power that is not at all restricted to what a grade your opponent is at. So depending on how many you're potentially able to set up on turn 3, you're just walloping your opponent for really big numbers, which is one of the big strengths of this deck. But then its second main effect is that when it attacks, you can soul blast 1, you choose a card from your rear guard or from your hand, put it as your gauge, and then they get the text triple drive until the end of turn. So just a simple, another way to fuel your gauge and get another card into the gauge, and she just gets the text triple drive. Now, unfortunately, it's not drive plus 1, so Sanctitude does get around this and allows you to have a free perfect guard for your opponent. But it's still triple drive. And triple drive is triple drive. So you're never going to say no to an extra card in hand. That can be very impactful depending on what you're going to check for your triggers, right? But the real key cornerstone to this card, what makes this card so good and have such an impactful turn quote unquote, is its divine skill, which I think is the most divine skill of all the divine skills, personally. What it is at the end of the battle that this unit attacked, if you have 5 or more cards in your gauge zone, you discard 2 cards from your hand, and then at the end of your turn, you get an additional turn. So you skip your opponent's turn and you go right back to yours. Now you skip the ride and main phase and go straight to combat. You do get stand and draw. So you'll stand, draw, skip ride, skip main, go to battle phase. So it's essentially a glorified board restand, but you get an extra draw because you're going through the draw phase. But that's also still very strong. So it's minimum 6 attacks with, and she does get -1 drive as well. But still, because of the triple drive, you're getting 3 drives and then 2 drives plus 4 other rear guard attacks. So it's a 6 attack turn, lots of drive checks, really big power because of that first skill. It's really difficult for your opponent to survive the divine skill turn, because that's just, you're asking for so many cards from their hand. So insanely good card. I don't think I need to overstate how good taking a pseudo quote unquote extra turn is. Even if you're limited to only a combat and draw phase, that's still very strong. So very good card, pretty straightforward. But it's also her rear guards that really make her shine. And the main one for that is the Acrononis Dragon. I definitely butchered that, but that's fine. Her grade 3 rear guard. This card is very good. Now, one of your main targets for what you're looking to put into your gauge zone. So what this does is, in your gauge zone, at the beginning of your battle phase, you can counterblast 1, choose a card from your drop zone, put it in your gauge, call this out of your gauge to rear guard circle. So really good loop you can get going with this. If you have one of this in the gauge, one of this in the drop zone, you can just cycle them like that. Call it out from the drop zone, or from the drop zone, put it in the gauge, call this one out, attack with it, gets retired or something happens, goes back to the drop, switch again. So that's really good. It's also at the beginning of the battle phase, so that also activates on the extra turn still, because you are just going to the battle phase. So when you hit that on the extra turn, if something happened to either of your rear guards, or if you just want a better rear guard, you can call this out and get something from your drop zone. So that's very good. But then his second skill is that when he attacks a Vanguard, if you have a grade 3 or greater with Leal in its name, he gets 5,000 power. And if you have 3 or more cards in your time gauge, he gets the Energy Blast 2 skill to retire an opponent's rear guard. Now, there's no restriction to what that rear guard is, no restriction on back row, front row, or grade. Just pop whatever you want. And it's for only Energy Blast 2. So that's a very efficient just retire. And if you have 2 of these set up on the board on the extra turn skill, that's not a hard once per turn. If you have all the energy, which you don't really use a lot of energy in this deck, that's a just essential board wipe. You can potentially just take out 4 rear guards on your opponent's turn, or during your turn if you're doing the divine skill. So that's very strong. A nice little board wipe for 8 energy. Not that bad, but it's just a consistent way of removing pieces off your opponent's board, which is very good. But the main thing is that first effect of being able, a great target for you to just put into the gauge zone off of Leal's effect or off of the grade 2 in the ride lane early, to be able to immediately call and start using it. So very strong card. You're definitely running 4 of this for sure. Now let's talk about the main card. You've already heard it referenced, the order card, the normal order, Distorted Bane. So it's a normal order, grade 3, that's got 2 effects. The first is just when you play it, you may soul charge 1, and if you do, it goes straight into the gauge zone. So that's really good. It's a great way to fuel that, and it's easy to get in there just by playing it. It goes straight there. So that's great. But then its second effect is when it's put into the gauge zone specifically, you get to draw a card and your Vanguard gets 10,000 power. So not only is it powering up your rear guards via Leal's effect to give your rear guards 5k for each copy of this in the bind zone, but this also just straight gives Leal 10,000 power, which is really good. So ideally what you're doing is you're setting up a way to get this into the gauge zone during the extra turn. Since it is an extra turn, you're losing Persona Ray power, trigger powers, and Leal will just be reset to a 13k. But if you're able to set this up, then it becomes 23. So very strong card. Gets you some extra draws, gets you some extra soul, which you need. It's what makes the deck function, just how easy it is to get in the gauge. It's your way to get to 5 gauge by turn 4. It's at the moment, there's no way to get this deck to 5 gauge before turn 4. And this is how you do it. You have to play this on turn 3 and you have to play this on turn 4. If you miss this on either of those turns, it feels really bad. So you really have to make sure you see this is why you run 4 and some searchers that we'll get to in a little bit. But let's first talk about some grade 2s. And the first one is a new boy, Almanac Colossus. Very good card for Leal specifically. And it's a very simple effect. Well, 2, I should say. The first is that when it's placed on rearguard, if you have a Regalis gauge, so just 1 card in your Regalis gauge, which is always going to be there on turn 2 because you're going to put 1 there from the ride line, you can counterblast 1, draw a card, and soul charge 1. So very similar to Distorted Bane in that the sense that it's just a soul charge and draw engine, which is great. You need both. Draw power is always good, so we just love that. There's no restriction aside from that 1 gauge, so you can throw this down immediately on turn 2, get some soul, draw a card, and then have a beater to run in. But also, his additional continuous effect is, so long as you have 3 or more in the gauge, this can boost. So that's actually really impactful in this deck because you've got your Leal Vanguard on it, obviously. And this is a great booster for to make good numbers, but you're also going to have a lot of grade 3 rear guards with this guy. And again, makes better numbers because he's the 10k base. So very good to be able to have a 10k booster in this deck, given all the grade 3s that you have. So definitely a 4 of. Next, surprising no one, we are doing 3 energy cyclers. This is just the generic everyone had got at the beginning of Divine Z. This is the same as all the other ones. When discarded from your hand, during the ride phase, you can counterblast 1 or energy blast 3 to draw cards. So it's just good discard fodder when you're going up the ride line. And then its second effect is the Persona Ride effect. That when it's placed on rear guard, if you Persona Ride this turn, counterblast 1 or energy blast 3, soul charge a card, and then it gets boost and 5,000 power. So the second effect is kind of you're not really going to use that in this deck unless you really just need an emergency rear guard to throw down, depending on what you're playing against. Like Varga, for example, wiping your board. That can be nice just to set itself up as a booster or just a 15k beater. That can be cool. It's really just here for the energy cycler. You're throwing it during the ride line or guarding with it to get a little bit extra draw. Very good card. Again, you're not really using energy for anything else actually aside from this and Colossus. So good inclusion here. Next, we are running 3 copies of Orions, the Tearfelt equivalent of Dark States. She is back and making an appearance because we are playing an order heavy deck where you have to be playing an order at least the first 2, if not 3 turns with Distorted Bane. So what does this card do? Very similar to Tearfelt in our other videos in the first skill. This is the exact same, I believe, which is that when it's placed on rear guard, other than by a card's ability, if you played a normal order this turn, Soul Blast 1, check top 5 cards of your deck, call a card, shuffle the rest back. So this is a great top searcher. Look for your pieces, look for things to call the board. Great way to find this if you haven't already. Search it off the top, a bunch of other pieces that you can look for. Grab that Colossus, throw it on the board. Just great. You're always going to be playing Distorted Bane, so this card's always going to be live. That's good. But then also its second effect can be kind of nice, which is that when it attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, you can Soul Blast 3, draw a card, and this gets 5k. So that you're not going to use all the time, but I'm playing a pretty heavy soul charge build, as you'll see in a little bit. So I'm able to activate this a little bit more often, and the draw is always just good to stay alive, obviously. And then being a 15k beater is better than a 10k beater, so we like that too. I like 3 copies for that. You don't necessarily need 4. I think 3 is good just to not clog yourself up too much. And then finally, of the last grade 2s to round it out, we are running our Regalis Piece Twin Cast. Because this is a deck where you're playing a normal order every turn, you're not really in a position to run any of the normal order Regalis pieces. And so I like Twin Cast as my Blitz order Regalis piece of choice. If you want to run the new one that came out with the start deck, with that manga grade 3, I forget his name, but I know that there's that Blitz order that comes out with him that's very good in this deck. You can run that if you don't have Twin Cast. I just like Twin Cast for the double guard. For those who don't know, it essentially is a Regalis piece that can guard twice. You can play it from your hand as a Blitz order for a 10k shield, and then it goes to your drop zone, and then in your drop zone, you can remove it from the game, and it's a 15k shield. So it's a 25 shield total, but you can use it twice. So that's the thing I really like about it. It's very versatile. You can use it in different guarding situations to be able to block different attacks with just one card. So that's what I really like about this. I think it's the best Blitz order still. But if you would prefer the other one, I wouldn't argue too hard. Grade 1s. Let's first talk about the new generic. That is unfortunately not very good. Is this guy, whose name I'm going to not even try and pronounce. Say Viscago or something like that. So these cards are interesting and bad. There's a lot of text here. But the first effect is just essentially that if you have a G-Zone, this card doesn't work. This card only gets all these effects if you don't have a G-Zone. So all the Stride decks can't use this card, which is ironic because the Stride decks, I feel like, are the decks that could really benefit from these cards the most. But they can't use them, so sucks to be them. But its first main effect is from your hand. If you're on a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, you discard this card, you search the top 7 cards of your deck for a grade 3 with a different name than your Vanguard, which is what makes this a bad card. Is that it has to be a different name from your Vanguard. I don't understand why it has that restriction. I feel like it would not have been broken, especially because it's just a top 7 search to just find a grade 3. I feel like a lot of decks could benefit from that. A lot of decks already have a way to search for Persona Ride. I don't know why they didn't just give everybody the ability to search for Persona Ride, but I digress. So you discard this card. And you have to remove 2 cards from your ride line from your solar drop and put them back into the ride line face up. So it's effectively a discard 1, Soul Blast 2, check top 7 for a different grade 3 than the one on your Vanguard, put it into your hand. If you did not find it off the top 7, this goes back to your hand, but the ride line cards do not go back to your soul or the drop zone, which hurts a lot. So that sucks. You the Soul Blast 2 essentially, then a permanent Soul Blast 2 that you cannot get back because they're going to the ride line is just gone if you whiff this. So big feel bad. You still run it though because it's just that important to make sure you see this card. So this is just emergency top 7 search for this. You just want to absolutely make sure you see it. So you're in 2. Certainly no more than 2 because that skill sucks. And obviously you only have 4 cards on the red line. So you wouldn't be able to use it more than twice anyway. He does have a second effect, I will say, which is that when it's placed on Guardian Circle, if you have 4 or more cards in Soul, which in this build of the deck isn't that hard, he gets 5k extra shield. So it's a 10k shield, which is the best part of this skill, honestly. It's just he's a 10k shield, grade 1. And then if your opponent has a G-Zone, you can take you can bind a grade 3 from your Soul or Drop Zone, and then this gets an additional 10k shield. So it becomes a 20k shield total against Stride decks, assuming you bind a grade 3 out of your Soul or Drop. So for that extra cost is a little but if you're against the Stride deck, which in a month they'll be a little bit more prominent again with Night Rose and Harry. It's a 20k shield. So there's that. Yeah. But honestly, the best thing you can say for this card is that most of the time it's going to be a 10k shield, which can be a little helpful. So that's great. You can tell my opinion of this card is very low, but you really have to see the grade 3, so you're running it too. Speaking of making sure you find your important pieces, we have a much better card in the Avarice Demon, Avarice Wrestler? Avarice Rester. Much better card. This is the generic grade 1 searcher that we got a little bit back, I think in set 2 of Divine Z. What this says is when this is placed on rearguard from your hand, if you did not play any order this turn, you can discard another card from your hand, and you can just search your deck for an order, put it into your drop zone, and then it gets the red text skill that you can play it from the drop zone, and if you do, it goes to the bottom of the deck. Now, why this is good in this deck should be obvious, because this lets you just search your deck for Distorted Bane and put it right into your drop zone. Now, you get to get around it goes to the bottom of the deck when played, because when you play this, remember, its skill says that it just goes straight to the gauge, and then it cannot come out of the gauge once it's there. So this skill supersedes the red text skill here of putting it on the bottom, which is very good. Plus, one of the things also good that you might sometimes do is you might use this skill just to put it in the drop zone and not even to use it, depending on the situation, just so you can then use Anachronous Dragon to bind it from the drop zone and when you call him out during the beginning of the battle phase. So very versatile, but the main thing is just making sure you see it. It's 3, I think of it just as 3 extra copies of Distorted Bane to make sure that it gets played at least once. So very good. 3 copies. You don't really need 4 just because you're eventually obviously going to run out of Distorted Bane and this becomes a dead card. But 3 feels like a good number just because you, during that first turn 1 and turn 3 and turn 4, where it is imperative that you see Distorted Bane, you want to make sure you have this just in case. Next, for probably the most controversial part of this video, I am running 3 Swirler. So this is what I've been alluding to when I say I'm playing a soul heavy build. I like the 3 Swirler. Now, I know a lot of people don't agree with Swirler in this deck, and I can see the argument particularly around the risk of deck out, which is definitely valid. You can deck out in this deck pretty quick, usually by turn 5, you're risking deck out. If they're not dead by that point, they should be dead on turn 4 when you Divine Skill, but if they somehow manage to survive, you've got 1 more turn before you deck out. Now, I think to offset that though, Swirler really brings a lot to the table right now when we don't have the grade 1 promo that's a copy of Shinri. For those who don't know, on the Japan side, they have a Dark States promo that's a grade 1 that says when it boosts, if you played in order, or if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards, it gets plus 5k, and at the end of the battle, you go to soul draw card. Obviously an excellent card in this deck because of Distorted Bane, where again, you're going to be playing in order every turn, so that card's always going to be live. If we had that card, this would be a different story. This would be in the slot instead of Swirler, and would definitely be a 4 of. But that card, we don't even have confirmation yet on the English side when or if we're getting it. So while we don't have it, I like Swirler because Swirler makes your turn 3 very strong. Because as you've heard with us talking through these skills, you will have noticed that there's a good amount of random soul charge. Distorted Bane is soul charging. Anachronous Colossus is soul charging. Steam Gunner can soul charge. Obviously, Swirler soul charges. So it's easy in this deck for Swirler, especially on that turn 3, depending what's in your hand, to pump Swirler up and get like 3, usually the average is like 3, maybe even 4 instances of its skill, which for those who don't know, Swirler is placed on rear guard, you soul charge 1, and then if you're on grade 3, it just has the auto skill whenever you randomly soul charge. So not just when anything goes into your soul from anywhere, when a card is soul charged by the skill soul charge 1. this unit gets 5,000 power. So whenever you use Distorted Banes, Soul Charge 1, 5k. Whenever you use the Colossus, Soul Charge 1, 5k. So 5k from his own skill, so on and so forth. He gets really big really fast. So like I said, your average usually on turn 3 is about 3 procs. So he's getting plus 15,000 power. So he's a 23k booster. Tie that to the fact that Distorted Bane is giving the rear guards plus 5k from Leal's skill. For each copy in your gauge zone, on average by turn 3, you usually have 2 in the gauge zone. So you're getting plus 10k to your rear guards. Anachronous Dragon is getting 5k from his own skill. Orion's is getting 5k from her own skill. So your numbers on turn 3 are big. You're hitting for 40s, 50k. While your opponent is potentially on grade 2 if you went first. That is incredibly difficult for them to stop, so they are forced to either perfect guard or get pushed to high damage. Ideally, you're doing the latter, because then if they're at 3 damage or higher, you've basically won the game. If they're at 3 damage, they're not surviving your Divine Skill turn, barring a crazy defensive hand. That's just, the Divine Skill turn is too much pressure for someone to be able to stop. So that's what Swirler is really good for. Swirler is great for setting up your kill turn on turn 4 by doing it turn 3. Just have your numbers are too big. Your opponent can't stop them unless they drop their perfect guards, which then means they don't have them for the Divine Skill turn. So that's why I like 3 Swirler. 4 is a little much because then you're definitely risking deck out. And you, because of the amount of draw on this deck, you tend to see them pretty regularly. So I like 3. Right now, I don't think you have a better alternative, personally. I think right now, before we get the Shinri clone, this is kind of the best grade 1 slot in here. It's just to get that big power on turn 3 to push your opponent to high damage. And then rounding out the grade 1s, obviously, you got your good old Sanctitude and your good old Nation Perfect Guards. I've said it once, said it 1,000 times. As we already talked about, in this video, Sanctitude lets you perfect guard for free if your opponent's Vanguard has the red text triple drive, which is what Leal gets when you use her skill. And the Nation Perfect Guards, you perfect guard for free if you have one list card in your hand. Straightforward to the point. You're never not doing this unless you're a grade 4 deck. Triggers. Let's see. So, as always, no shock that it is 8 crits. I would recommend the Go to Soul crit just for emergency soul charge. It is possible, even with Swirler, to run out of soul in this deck. And obviously, Leal needs a Soul Blast 1 to activate her effect to get triple drive. So, while unlikely, it is good to have these if you just need to emergency throw it down as a 4k booster to go to Soul and get the extra soul. Plus the 2k can matter depending on your lines. Again, because you have a lot of the grade 3 units between Leal and the Dragon. If you are boosting with a grade 1 like Swirler or Avarice Wrestler, that 2k actually can matter and make a better number and make them line up where they're hitting for 10k interval as opposed to 8. So that can be good. 8 crit. For obvious reasons. Crits are crits. Now for the off trigger, I am running fronts, and the main reason is because I don't want to deck out. If you run draws in this deck, you will deck out. I've seen people run draws, and that is incorrect. I'm sorry. I don't normally have a definitive yes, I'm completely and totally against something. I am completely against draws in this deck. You will kill yourself playing this deck. If you are running draws. The fronts in particular, I think, are good because, one, the 20k shield is 20k shield, and 20k shields are super important right now. They're more important than ever. It keeps feeling like every set we're keeping wow, we really need more shield value because of the amount of power the decks in the meta are pushing out. So I feel like the 20k shield is super important. The fronts, well, a good chunk of the time, you are not going to have a full front row because you're going to want to be binding from your rear guard, not your hand. Sometimes you are going to bind from your hand, in which case the fronts 10k matter. And even if you only have the one other rear guard, that can still be a good push just to make them hit even bigger numbers. So I definitely say forefront. for sure. Heal triggers. We are doing 2 generics still and 1 each of the crit and restand heal. As always, this is a meta call. I think these are still good to have 1 of each, just depending on what you run into. The restand heal obviously is very good against Varga. The crit right now is really good against Destined King and Blingmire. But you have stuff like this deck, and Destined King also kind of to an extent, Faded King especially, where they're not restanding or getting a crit. And Destined King, he gets a crit, which is why we know. But the rear guards aren't doing that. The rear guards are just attacking multiple times. And in Faded King's case, there's nothing. No restands, no crits, nothing. So because of that, I definitely recommend 2 generic heals just for the extra shield at all times, no matter what you are getting smacked with, just to have the 15k. Overtrigger reveal. So I normally have 1 definitive answer, but I am actually going to cheat a little bit and give you 2 because I think you have basically an equal argument for both. Now, I personally, right now, I am running purple. I like purple a lot in this deck because you, like I mentioned, a lot of the time you're going to have an open front row rear guard circle. So the purple's ability to call a card from your hand and give it 10,000 power always works a lot better in this deck than it does in some other ones. And then also its ability to get a card from your damage zone and put it into your hand is huge as an emergency save Distorted Bane from the damage zone, because you have no other way of getting this card out of the damage zone. So it's huge for that. You're usually going to have an open rearguard circle to maximize its full effect. So I really like purple in this deck. Now, as for the Dark States Overtrigger, I definitely see the argument on the offense side. If you hit this early enough, like by turn 2 or turn 3, and so that it's live for both of your Vanguard swings during the extra turn, that's very impactful. Because as we mentioned, Leal on that extra turn loses a lot of power. But if you have this, that makes up for it because it's getting an extra 10,000 power and a crit for the rest of the game, right? Plus the crit pressure then becomes really impactful because you're essentially then becoming a restanding Vanguard with plus 10k and a crit. So that is very strong. I definitely see that argument. I like that a lot. I guess it really depends on which way you want to go. Do you want to be more aggressive and really push the aggro with the extra 10k and the crit? Or do you want to play a little bit more conservatively and a little bit more consistent with being able to get the Destined Bane, Distorted Banes, or other cards that are really important, like an Anachronous Dragon that you've lost to damage zone, to get them back, as well as making up some of your rearguard slots that you've lost from binding them. So I like purple, but unlike with the draw triggers, I don't argue with this choice at all. I think this is a perfectly good. I think they're essentially equal in how good they are for this deck. It just really depends on what your focus is. But you can certainly go Dark States. But purple is what I am doing right now, and I personally like purple a lot, just for that consistency help. And yeah, that is it. That is Leal. Like I mentioned, should we get the Shinri promo, assuming we will, this deck build changes quite a bit. But we don't have it, so this is what I'm doing for now until we do. I like this deck a lot. The extra turns feels very impactful. You're just getting so much power and a lot of draw ability that it's hard for your opponents to keep up, even some of the big ones like Destined King and Faded King, depending on who goes first, as well as Varga. It's very much, unfortunately, kind of has turned the game even more than it already was into a who goes first meta right now. Because whoever goes first right now of the big 4 between this, Faded King, Destined King, and Varga, it definitely has an advantage for sure. In this deck particularly, because if you get to your turn 4 extra turn while your opponent has only had 1 grade 3 turn, that's huge. They're probably not living. So I like this deck. I think the extra turn mechanic is cool. I think the gauge skill is cool. It gives you a good amount to think about without being overly complicated, and just kind of hits that perfect balance for me of a deck that is got some combos, but isn't like overly technical like Shoujo Doji or something like that. So I love this deck. I hope it continues to get support. We'll see if it does. And we'll continue to update as we go along. Yeah, if you have questions or comments, I'm happy to talk through thoughts of this deck, as I am very excited for it, if you couldn't tell. And we'll see more from us soon for set 5. Thanks. Bye.